Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Michael Wirtz. I'm at the Center for American Progress, one of the organizations that co-sponsored the food scenario game that we're going to be talking about today. Let me first of all thank the sponsors and supporters and a group of organizations that made this amazing venue possible. We had strong private sector support from Cargill and Mars. We were a great team between the Center for American Progress, the World Wildlife Fund, and we were blessed by working with CNA Corporation, formerly known as the Center for Naval Analysis, and their two star wargamers put the scenario together for us. And things worked out that are actually not supposed to work out because it was a very complex undertaking, and you're going to hear more about this. It's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker, Senator Tom Daschle, a very experienced political hand in this town, has served as the Democratic Senate leader that survived the job for the longest period of time, over a decade. That's quite an achievement, even though it was a different institution back in your days. But when retiring from public service, the senator didn't spend his time playing golf or vacationing. He really used his 30-plus year policy experience, and he has been virtually part of policy debates in this country in every key policy issue over the last 3 decades, and has really gotten involved in discussions about renewable energy policies, health policies, and food and climate issues. And we asked him to serve as a lead participant in our scenario game. He gave us 2 full days of his busy schedule, and has been a key player in this undertaking. And he has also been somebody that has been an important advisor. And when we asked him to kick off this afternoon's event, he again agreed to do so. We're extremely grateful to you, Senator. Thank you so much for your support. It's very important to us to know that people like you are on our side when it comes to disseminating information about the issues that we care so much about. And thank you for your friendship over the past few years.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and congratulations to you and to all of those who have had so much to do with the success of this whole experience. The sponsors, the organizers, it has really been a remarkable event to witness, and I celebrate with all of you as we look to what we do as we go from here. I want to thank you all for braving the cold weather and being with us this afternoon. We're gathered to discuss a challenge that is shaping the very trajectory of world affairs. And that will help determine whether we create a more peaceful, stable, and collaborative world in the decades ahead. That challenge is global food security. The nations of the world have made impressive progress and significantly have done work in reducing hunger levels in recent decades that is notable. It was 20 years ago that the member states of the World Food Summit in Rome agreed to an ambitious program. They pledged at the time, and here I quote, "a common and national commitment to achieving food security for all and to an ongoing effort to eradicate hunger in all countries, with an immediate view to reducing the number of undernourished people to half their present level no later than 2015. Well, today we know that the global community fell short of its goal, but the effort still yielded very meaningful results. Despite rapid population growth in the developing world, almost 170 million fewer people are undernourished today than a decade ago. And against this backdrop, global leaders came together just last year to craft a new list of sustainable development goals and continue building on these achievements. But despite this progress, we have a lot of work before us. The 2015 report of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations held 2 sobering facts that underline the challenge ahead. Almost 800 million people are still suffering hunger. And in recent years, progress has been hindered by slower and less inclusive economic growth. as well as political instability in some developing regions, such as Central Africa and Western Asia. Our progress is fragile because the world is changing in rapid and very profound ways. We have a distinguished panel here today, as you can see from the names, to discuss these dynamics in depth. But I wanted to open the discussion today by sharing a few of my own deep concerns and present a challenge to all of you as we look to the next steps. Many of these concerns were on display during the future scenario exercise that we held for 2 days in November, an event called the Food Chain Reaction. We gathered experts from around the world, policy leaders from India and Europe, world-renowned scholars from China, former cabinet officials and climate negotiators from the United States, agricultural and environmental experts from Brazil and Africa, and a number of international business leaders. All convened in Washington to game out a scenario set in the years 2020 to 2030 in which pressure on the global food system was mounting. We hoped that our scenario game would provide insights into how nationals and multilateral organizations could react to these complex crises in new or maybe even different ways. We expected to gain insights into how far players would go to meet climate and food and security challenges in the future, and whether their responses would be cooperative or competitive. We were interested in defining the gaps in our strategic planning processes and in the areas in which new research or more sophisticated intelligence and intellectual infrastructure is necessary. The exercise did not disappoint. The scenario dramatically showed the ways in which climate change and human mobility can combine to exacerbate food insecurity and truly threaten political stability. As I watched this simulation unfold, I observed a number of things that built upon our working hypothesis. Food security and climate are not just humanitarian and environmental goals any longer. They touch upon core national security interests and the stability of entire regions. And players increasingly realized that as the game wore on. The complex crisis scenario we grappled with felt all too realistic. It was similar to the challenges we have faced in the past decade, challenges that are outpacing policy responses and forcing us to rethink traditional business models and institutional arrangements. I saw how important it is to increase awareness of food security among traditional security and governance policymakers, and to introduce food security challenges into their thinking and planning. While these shareholders learned valuable lessons over the course of the scenario, in the real world, the stakes are too high for delay. I saw the need to challenge private sector actors to invest more in long-term assessments and strategic planning. And lastly, the exercise was a real reminder that we have to rethink the way our multilateral institutions are dealing with these complex issues, because they risk being overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge today. I know addressing these concerns will be a difficult task, but we've made revolutionary progress in food security before. The food security exercise provided an excellent foundation for the work ahead, and that is why we're here today, to build upon the lessons that we have learned in the simulation. But let me reflect again on the importance of these lessons. Last year, as the game was being designed, real-world food insecurity bore a significant resemblance to what our exercise actually modeled. Erratic weather conditions, such as hotter temperatures and unpredictable rain patterns, likely linked to climate change, altered food supply chains here in the United States and around the world. Food security became embroiled with traditional notions of security and geopolitics. 2015 saw Russia use agricultural markets as a punitive tool of foreign policy. In Yemen and South Sudan, among other places, conflict prevented effective food distribution. In Syria, our militias and the regime used starvation as a military tactic. And in Iraq, ISIS sought to control grain silos and hold civilian populations to ransom for their next meal. And the challenges of food security are only growing even more complicated. Today, food security is increasingly contributing to and being exacerbated by complex crises that combine climactic, sociopolitical, religious, and security stresses. Studying the interaction of these stresses and crafting new ways to respond to them coherently are among the biggest challenges facing the international community today. Yemen is a particularly devastating example of conflict contributing to food security. Last year, more than 40% of Yemen's population was classified as food insecure, half of them severely so. Just a few weeks ago, the New York Times reported that 80% of Yemen's population is in dire need of food, water, and other aid, and that starvation of civilians is now being used as a deliberate method of warfare. Yet Yemen is not alone. We've seen similar trends in other parts of the Middle East and Africa in the past decade. Similar barbaric tactics are being used in Syria, where the Assad regime has sought to starve rebellious areas into submission now for years. And the casualty around food security and climate stresses run in both directions. Food insecurity can contribute to instability and violence, just as surely as instability and violence can lead to food insecurity. In Syria, today, regrettably, both are true. Between 2006 and 2011, over 60% of Syrian territory endured the worst long-term drought in recorded history. The country's total water resources were literally cut in half, with disastrous implications for rural areas. The primary northeastern wheat growing region suffered a 75% crop failure and 85% losses in livestock. The UN estimated that 800,000 Syrians lost their livelihood as a result of these droughts. 1 million were declared food insecure. 3 million Syrians were driven into extreme poverty. This profound climate and food crisis led to a large-scale migration. In 2010 alone, 50,000 Syrian families moved to cities from rural areas, and in 2011, an estimated 200,000 rural Syrians left the rural areas for cities. Syria's urban centers were ill-equipped to deal with this influx, with poor infrastructure and their own endemic water shortages, with incredibly high unemployment. This increased disaffection with the government, which was unable to respond effectively to the social and health needs of migrants, brought diverse ethnic and religious groups into close contact under trying circumstances and contributed to protests which, following Assad's brutal reception, morphed into civil war. Now let's be clear. Climate change and food insecurity alone did not cause the rebellion, but they contributed to the circumstances that gave rise to it. And similar stresses could well drive the next major upheaval in the Middle East or elsewhere. And unless we invest the time to unravel the complexity of these dynamics, we won't be ready for the next crisis. Without a sound academic foundation, we will continue to lose arguments calling for proactive efforts to address root causes and prevent conflict, rather than react to them after the fact. The food chain reaction players dealt with these complexities last November. But while that scenario began in 2020, these are not just future challenges. They are upon us. They are upon us today. These trends have already contributed to human suffering and the collapse of states repeatedly over the past decade. Fortunately, our preventative measures and the responses by the UN organizations and others continue to improve. But to truly get ahead of the problem, we need to challenge ourselves to think more deeply about the future, to imagine and anticipate the next challenge. And that's why we need simulations like this one, so that we can begin to define what policy changes, what government institutions and investments we need to change or to build. We are living in an incredibly turbulent, transformational time, but also in an era of tremendous opportunity. We have the capacity to anticipate many challenges, as proven by the successful game that underpins today's events. One positive takeaway was that big changes are possible when people and nations work together. Hopefully, this intellectual capital will allow us to move toward big ideas and a much more comprehensive set of solutions. For this reason, I see today's event as a call to action, in the narrowest sense, to continue the work that CNA Corporation, the Center for American Progress, and the World Wildlife Fund have begun to spread awareness and explore future scenarios. But more broadly, we're all asking the people who have come today, to have come to this meeting this afternoon, to commit not just to manage these issues of today, but to make investments and develop ideas that will help us get to where we need to be tomorrow. So I hope you'll listen closely to our panelists today and take their ideas and lessons with you. This combination of participants, our policy experts, our NGOs, our businesses, and the media is exactly the right group of people to help us move forward. If we can chart a cooperative course to address food security and the climate factors that contribute to it, I know we can rise to this challenge once again. So I thank you for joining us today, and now let me turn it over to our moderator, Alan Bierga of Bloomberg News. Alan?
Thank you, Senator Daschle. My name is Alan Bierga. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News, and I was a participant in Food Chain Reaction, playing the role of independent media. Media, like many institutions, and like many of us in our lives, like to think of ourselves often as leading players in a scenario, and often in reality our role is minor and somewhat comic. But we learned a lot, and I've learned a lot from the conclusions that we've seen in this, as often as a member of the media, you actually aren't in the room where the decisions are being made, even though people will put the happiest face on it afterwards for you. So the goal here is to really get you into the room, to understand what the Food Chain Reaction exercise was all about, but then also to broaden the discussion to those issues that Food Chain Reaction rose, and some of the broader conversation about food security that must be so important to everyone here today. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here today or on the webcast. So before we bring up our panelists, and actually while our panelists will be ascending to their positions, we're going to show you a brief video about the exercise and about what this is all about. Thank you. Our first panelist, we're going to be working from your right over to the left, is Matthias Berninger. He is the Vice President for Public Affairs at Mars Incorporated, previously active in Germany's parliament, where he was a four-term member representing the Green Party. At Mars, he's been very active in sustainability issues, dealing with cocoa supply chains and other issues of resource management. One of the issues that came up, one of the key gaps identified in Food Chain Reaction was a productivity gap. And the idea that with a rising population, there's going to be a need for, of course, more food production. But more production comes with some externalities, with some issues in terms of sustainability, in terms of agricultural use of resources. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit over the next couple decades what challenges we will face in terms of that balance between productivity and sustainability, and what strategies can be pursued to maintain the proper balance.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. when people look at productivity, they tend to focus on the farms. But it's really the whole food chain we need to look at. And there are a couple of changes that I believe need to happen. First of all, we need to have more resilient supply chains, which means that we need to be much more responsive to the diversity of agricultural production in the world. And for me, that means everything from professionalizing farms all the way down to working on things like the African orphan crops, on the traditional crops farmers have been using, and helping to leverage modern technology to grow those plants much more effectively. But it moves on to ensuring that less food gets lost in the supply chain. The whole transportation and storage of food is broken in many parts of the world, and it's not a surprise that those parts are the parts with the highest pressure at this point. Food safety plays an enormous role. Everybody takes food safety for granted. The reality is that we are failing currently to provide sufficient amounts of safe food for the world. And then lastly, yes, the food industry is able to produce tremendous amounts of staple food at scale, but usually at price points for people who have a lot of money. Can we translate all that knowledge of the food industry into products people can afford who are just above the poverty line is going to be another big challenge. So all of those things need to work together. And I think there needs to be an increased trust of the different actors in this space to kind of look at innovation. And one of the problems I see is that in the food world, there's much more distrust than we can afford at this point in time.
It sounds like you're talking about not only a productivity gap, but perhaps an access gap as well in terms of the price points you're discussing. In that sense, will solving a productivity gap alone create a greater food security, or are these issues that must be dealt with in tandem?
Well, I think being able to produce food more effectively will for sure be part of the solution. But the real challenge is that we need to look food insecurity in different parts of the world. We need to continue to look at rural communities, but we need to look at cities in the same way. And in many ways, Alan, again, there starts a fight. Those who say that the focus should be on rural areas try to play down famine in the cities. And then the other way around, those who want to have a more focus on smaller and mega cities in the world try to belittle the problems in rural areas. And I think the real topic is to look at this as a systemic problem and to broaden the whole debate from the solutions we have discussed in the past. I think the one insight of this scenario game we were participating in, it requires a totally different way to collaborate, much more uncommon collaboration compared to what we have seen in the past.
David McLaughlin is the World Wildlife Fund Senior Vice President for Sustainable Food and has spent much of his life and career focused on Latin America. He's been the leader of Chiquita's banana operations in Costa Rica, has worked with environmental communities, has also helped make Chiquita become the first multinational to be certified by the Rainforest Alliance, now is working on multifaceted strategies to engage directly with the business community and multi-stakeholder certification systems and consumers. That's a lot of different people that you work with, David. Given your work now with the World Wildlife Fund and your history of working with governments, with business communities, with other NGOs, with consumers, with smallholder farmers, when you were in Food Chain Reaction, in some ways this communication that Matthias was talking about was kind of easy because everyone there cared about food. And when you're working with larger entities, you're really only one constituency fighting for attention. In reality, what steps have you found you can take to make sure that when decisions are being made that affect global food security, that you are at the table, especially, frankly, in these better times when the rest of the world isn't paying attention to you?
Yeah, tough question. From my experience, and I look back sort of at my 8 years at WWF, we found, first of all, is really in terms of our work, whether it's on certification or whether it's working a lot with the global brands, is really educating them on their supply chains and really kind of the complexities behind those supply chains. What we found is that most companies are really blind to that, right? And so really it's an educational process and making people very much aware of where their food comes from and the issues behind that, right? And really understanding a lot that happens on the ground that many people aren't really well aware of, whether it's illegal production, whether it's encroachment. And in our work, we just see, one of the biggest concerns I have is that we just have this trajectory right now where we're really degrading our natural resource base. And our ability to produce food going forward is going to be even harder and harder as our water resources and our land resources are being further degraded. And so we've got considerable challenges. We saw a lot of that coming out of the food games in terms of really trying to help build that up and try to change the trajectory. But it's going to be a really, really huge challenge, especially when you consider the population growth is going to be happening in places that are already food insecure and their natural resource base has been really, really degraded.
You're talking about natural resource bases. A question pops into my head. Do you deal with stakeholders who have a profound influence on food security, who may not even be thinking about how they're influencing food security?
Yes, we do. From a standpoint in terms of just really building out a lot of these supply chains. One of the things that's WWF in terms of its strategy and that we've been working on in the last year or so is really recognizing just how much food is local and really needing to understand the local component of that, right, and how it plays into it. So the access issue, whether it's rural communities, most of the smallholder farmers are producing food for themselves, not cash crops. And so how do you get the technology and how do you build out those systems so that they become much more resilient? So it's much more complex, right? And that's kind of one of the big shifts that we're seeing as we kind of pivot on our own strategy that we've been developing over the years, is really understanding that local component to it, because that's going to be a huge, huge role in all of this going forward.
Tim Bowden is an economist with Cargill who has worked everywhere from South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa to the former Soviet Union, where he was on the ground in the 1990s looking for opportunities. He analyzes dynamic agricultural markets and is working in forecasting global trends, a big part of actually formulating the scenario itself. I'd first like to ask you about the scenarios itself that were created and the importance of keeping it real in the sense of making sure that when people look at the problem of food security, that they understand the enormity of what the problem is, as well as some of the dimensions of what it is not.
Thanks for that question, Alan. We were very concerned in the food chain reaction game that the scenarios be very, very realistic. There's a whole spectrum of opinions and beliefs about the climate change problem in the world, from at one extreme people that have completely bought in and agree with the science to a lot of people that are questioning still. And we found that it's very important, as we try to appeal to the people that are still struggling with the science, we found it's very, very important not to exaggerate in any way. So what we did is we recreated events that were like the past, as extreme as the past, but even somewhat more so. And we pushed beyond that, as we expect the science tells us we will occur. So we were very overt about not exaggerating.
And of course, to come up with accurate forecasts, you need the best data available. One of the findings of this report was a call for a dashboard that would maintain data on global food supply demand, weather, demographic trends, etc., maintained by an honest broker that the world could go to and get a handle on the problem and how best to deal with it. How would that be different from the many sources that we have now? And frankly, how do you surmount the desire on the part of some for a little bit of uncertainty? You represent the world's largest grain trader, and having more knowledge than the other guy is a competitive advantage. How do you balance that individual interest with sort of this global, worldwide interest that was identified in food chain reaction?
There's a lot of data out in the public realm already from USDA, from FAO, from various relief agencies, and people watching on an early warning basis for problems. We are contributing data from ourselves, from Cargill, and other corporations are also obligated to contribute data to governments, and we do so willingly, and we are very supportive because we believe transparency and knowledge about food systems and the situation that we're in today is it leads to better decisions by all parties, and so we are very happy to disclose things as long as the identity of the supplier of the information is withheld and it's consolidated and the identity stripped out in an aggregation process. Once the information is made available to all parties, we reserve the interest and the right, I think, to try to understand the data better than our competitors. It is an issue of competition. We're trying to be very, very efficient, and we compete with a lot of people, and we are trying to understand and digest information better than them for our competitive advantage. And when it comes to information that is for the public good as opposed to our competitive advantage against our competitors, which is to improve efficiency, when it's for the public good, we disclose a lot of information more or less behind closed doors. Our opinions about the way the world works, what the problems are, what the challenges are, and we ask that as we disclose that to people representing the public interest that they keep that as confidential as possible.
Dr. Nutan Kaushik was with the Center for Bioresources and Biotechnology in India, an expert on integrated pest management with over 20 years of research experience focused on analytical and natural product chemistry, the development of botanical pesticides, study of pesticides residues, metabolism of pesticides, everything that you can think of, essentially. You've been looking at this from a scientific perspective, wondering why the policymakers do what they decide to do. One statement that came up in the report was that in the interactions of the group, the linkages between climate and food security came relatively easily, more so than the linkages that were being made between food security and water, food security and energy. Why is that? And as a researcher who's interested in the public and policymakers understanding these issues, what do you do to surmount that?
Thanks, Ellen. Regarding this food security and issues, and the climate change and food security is directly linked, but food security is also linked to many other issues, like as you rightly mentioned about the water issues, water use efficiency, and also the energy efficiency. Energy, as we really see the contribution of the agriculture in terms of the GHG emissions, it's largely because of the energy use in agriculture, which is contributing to the GHG emissions and also leading to the climate change. So we need to really look at this water use efficiency, also the technological solutions. If we are talking about the climate resilient agriculture, we need to think about the climate resilient technologies for the farming communities. If we do not provide the climate resilient farming technologies to the farming communities, the farmers are not going to sustain the productivity. Just to highlight one particular case, the 0.5 degrees centigrade rise in the temperature is going to impact the yields of the farmers by 10 to 15%. So we are talking about the 2 degrees centigrade of the temperature rise that will lead to about 30 to 40% of the yield hamperment, yield decline in the yield. So what we are going to do about it, we need to have the technology, we need to have the varieties which can take care of this temperature. We need to develop the varieties which are heat tolerant. We need to develop the varieties which are drought tolerant, so that they can take care of the water issues. So the government has to invest lot more in R&D, research and development, to develop the technological solutions, to provide the technological solutions to the farming community, to give the climate resilience so that they can cope up with the climate related issues. There are many technologies regarding the water. What is going to be one of the critical things is very important thing for the agriculture. So there are many practices which can enhance the water use efficiencies, like simple, for example, if we talk about the rice, simple technological practices like the direct seeding of the rice can save a lot of water. SRI practices, it can save a lot of water. Sprinkler irrigation, it can save a lot of water. So there are many practices, not only but also the technologies like the less water use, like drought tolerant varieties can enhance the water use efficiency in the agriculture sector. Then rainwater, we are wasting a lot of rainwater. If we can do the rainwater harvesting, structures can be developed at farming community. That could be one of the great solutions for this farming community. So these are the likewise there are many technological solutions which need to be provided to the farming community in order to cope up with this. So the policy makers need to take care of this need for the investment in the R&D, which can take care of the problems of the climate, impact of the climate on agriculture productivity.
And at this point in the discourse that you encounter in your work with non-scientists, do you feel that there is enough of an understanding that climate change is a problem of now and not something that will be happening?
I think so. We are now realizing that if we really see the last year in 2014, 14 extreme events were linked directly to the climate change, which were like, if we see the past, it was the numbers used to be only 4 or 5. Now last year, if we look at the data of 2014, it has been now like directly, they have been extreme events are the events which are which can lead to a lot of problems to the farming community. Like they are the floods, droughts, floods, cyclones, which directly hamper the agriculture productivity. So it's not an event of the future, it's happening, and now we have been witnessing it. So this is being now acknowledged by the policymakers as well.
Geraldo Martha serves as the coordinator of Embrapa Scientific Cooperation Program in the United States, representing Brazil for the purposes of food chain reaction. The agronomist in the past 15 years has coordinated more than a dozen research projects and published more than 120 scientific and technological papers. So you've been working very much with technology as a tool of alleviation of issues with food security. In the food chain reaction discussion, did you feel that technology had its proper place in the discussion, and that there was a sufficient appreciation of the role that technology can play as an alleviation of the issues of food security?
For sure. During the food chain reaction, it was highlighted the importance of technology in transforming agriculture. Just to give an example, in terms of Brazil, now 68% of the agricultural product in Brazil is already depending on technology. So if we consider the challenges ahead, technology will be more and more important. And what has been this role, for example, of technology in Brazil? Up to mid-70s, the yield increase for major crops in Brazil was about 4 kilograms per hectare per year. A lot of flat, you know. Following this technology transformation in Brazilian agriculture, I mean technology more and more based on science, if you take from 1975 to 2015, yields increase average. I have here 64.3 kilograms per hectare per year. This is huge. And with this yield increase, we have the so-called land effects. What is this land effect? Is the land set aside, you know, because there's no need to put more land into cultivation because we are increasing productivity. Instead of using, for example, 2 or 3 hectares to triple the corn yield from 3 to 9, we only use 1 because we can jump to 7 or 9 tons per hectare. The land save effect in Brazilian agriculture, it was over 600 million hectares. 600 million hectares. This is greater than the European continent. And what is amazing is that, in spite of becoming a huge food producer, a huge world food producer, Brazil still has more than 60% of its territory preserved. Actually, 62% of the Brazilian territory is still preserved. So, for sure, technology is really important, and I think this importance of continue these R&D efforts in the long term was pretty well highlighted in the final report.
Are you going to be able to keep up that pace of productivity and the add-on effects with sustainability? And do you need to keep up that sort of a pace in the next couple decades?
Yeah, this is the huge challenge, and because of this, we need to bring also the private sector, to do more research. When you go to rich countries, such as the OECD countries, half of the research effort comes from the public sector, and the other half comes from the private sector. When you go, for example, in terms of Brazil is a point out of the curve, because we're investing 1.6% of the agricultural GDP. This is pretty high for our level of income, but around 10% of the effort comes from the private sector. So 90% still is coming from the public sector. And when you go to low-income countries, this is really, really important to increase the R&D effort, because we are talking about an intensity of investments in research of only 0.5, 0.6% of the agricultural GDP. So indeed, we have the opportunity to keep pace, but we need to put more and more effort, not only in generating new technologies, but also in transfer these technologies to farmers.
So one of the reasons that food chain reaction was put into place, I would presume, and one of the reasons that we are all here today, and one of the reasons that we continue to discuss this issue despite a couple food security problems in the past decade on the global scale, is because it's hard. Food security has proven to be hard, as 800 million people today can attest. So if we assume that food security is hard, and that folks got together for a couple days and worked through a decade of food security issues in that period of time, there were probably some parts that were hard. And I would like to open up the discussion to the full panel to ask about, within the exercise itself, what was the hardest part? What pushed you out of your comfort zone? And how did you best try to resolve that difficulty? Opening it up.
Yeah, for me, I would say probably it really came to bear in round 4. We had gone through 3 separate rounds. And mind you, I wasn't a player. I was a controller watching the team. But in the 4th round, when the situation got really bad, it was the U.S. team just said, we really aren't going to be able to sit here and just do this and make our own steps, and really reached out to the rest of all of the community and got everyone together. But it got just to a realization, hey, we aren't going to be able to do this alone. We've really got to get everyone put together, and that's when it all really came together in the final stage, right, for round 4. So it was really leading up to that. Countries were all making their moves, some bilateral agreements and things like that, but really to kind of go for increment or for exponential change, it was really about getting everyone together in the same room and really kind of driving the collaboration together.
So I'd like to add to that. In that 4th round, as Dave was saying, it became very dramatic. A lot of the groups came together. There was a global collaboration that occurred. It was a United Nations event to study the issues of climate change and food security to improve the future. One notable issue, as everybody came together for that, the business and investors team was left out. And I don't know, it might have been just an oversight, but my point of that would be that the business groups have something to contribute. There's a lot of knowledge about what will work, what won't work, what's practical, what's not, and we weren't at the table. And, I don't think we should be deciding policy as business people. Policymakers should be deciding policy, but we should be providing some input.
Matthias?
What I found quite sobering is that this whole scenario game was not factoring in 2 elements. The difficulties of some of the political decision-making in terms of changing legislation, regulations, so people had a lot of freedom there. And frankly, also, there weren't that many budgetary constraints. So if you think about something being really difficult with those 2 things not playing a role, that gives you a flavor how big a challenge the whole food security challenge is today.
And it's also worth noting that during this decade of the teams, there were no changes in administrations. There were no shiftings of political crosswinds. Everyone was just stable, and apparently everyone who was in government was reelected time and time again. Well, maybe if you look at some statistics on Congress, that was realistic. But there were some striking decisions that were made. For example, there was a temporary relaxation of the Common Agricultural Policy in the European Union. U.S. biofuels mandates pretty much collapsed at the first sign of crisis. These are challenging things to imagine in a real-world political context. Assuming, again, and this is more towards folks who work with governments, it gets back to that question of getting on the government agenda. What are some real-world approaches that a person can take to make this issue compelling at that broader policy level?
Well, one issue that we have noticed is in the biofuels area, for instance, mandates, which can be very inflexible and can stress the food system, need to be more flexible. And so, because they endanger human nutrition in the event of crop shortages. So one of the things that as business we can do is explain that dynamic to policymakers and ask them to consider, making the policies more flexible and create less risk.
Yeah, I've been on both sides, as you said in the introduction, on both sides of this conversation in my professional career. And for me, it comes down to trust. And the challenge I see in the food security debate when it comes to industry is that the food industry can play a role in helping to solve some of those food security problems, but at the same time, it's also being seen as responsible for some of the challenges. We very often speak about the double burden of nutrition. And of course, it's not easy for the political side to say, we invite you to the table, but at the same time give you a huge responsibility for the obesity challenges. So I think there needs to be a very honest conversation about what stops either side to trust the other side to really make a meaningful contribution. And that really doesn't happen. So it's almost like an invisible kind of ceiling that leads to the scenario that Tim described, that ultimately the exchange is very inhibited. And for me, it requires kind of a bit of a leap of faith on all sides of the equation, including David on the side of the NGOs.
Taking some this biofuel issue again, I think it's very important what Tim has highlighted, because one thing that is pretty much interesting is that not all biofuels are equal, For example, some of the things that pop up for Brazil was the case of biofuels in Brazil. But at the aggregated level of the country, there is no such a thing as a competition, because we are increasing everything. I mean, we are increasing food, feed, biofuels, and we are still preserving a lot of the country. So this kind of, differentiation, not put all the things in the same basket is really important. And another thing to highlight is some new issues started to be highlighted in the discussions. For example, not only the nutrition and health, but the potential for this bioeconomy era that we are moving into. So we are going to need more biomass. More biomass means that perhaps the pressure over the food systems might gain another competitor. So we need to take this account. And again, I think the answer would be to make good policies, but also good technology, because technology will be the solution to keep all this demand that this will be growing in the next decade.
So it would be safe to say from your observations, you would agree that solutions are not for nations or regions may not be one size fits all.
Exactly. We need to cooperate at the international level. This is critical. But sometimes you can pick up a solution, say, from the temperate temperate region, and try to apply in a tropical region. Eventually, this is not the case. So we need to prospect what would be good solution. We need to identify what can be applied everywhere, but we need also to say, well, this kind of solution fits better in tropical regions, this kind of solution fits better in other kinds of regions and whatever.
Yeah, Alan, and to your question and sort of your previous comment about the political realities, on this particular issue, reflecting back on the debate within the U.S. team on the biofuel issue, definitely was divided within the team, going back and forth, and really, the way forward really was around phasing out the existing mandates, but also reinvesting into second generation. So it's kind of moving forward. We've accomplished what we need to accomplish on the current mandates. Let's move forward with the second gen, then let's phase this out. But definitely that was probably the most divisive issue within the U.S. team in terms of dealing with that.
Well, it's striking also that the approach that you just described sounds a lot like what was envisioned in the 2007 version of the Renewable Fuel Standard, where we were supposed to be using a lot of cellulosic ethanol by now.
Right, right.
That which was old can become new again. And it leads me into the final question before we sort of transition into a different phase of this discussion, which is noting, Tim and others work hard to make sure that we have realistic scenarios for the 2020s. And in Food Chain Reaction, there were 2 food price spikes in a decade that were pretty severe. I think we can attest to the realism of this scenario, given that there have been 2 big food spikes in the last decade that we've actually had to deal with. Setting aside public policy for a moment, because it's very easy to start obsessing about that in a Washington, D.C. setting, and that may not be of greatest interest to the broader world that will be watching this presentation. In the past decade, what progress have we made in food security from the science standpoint, from the use of data standpoint, from the crisis response standpoint, things that we have learned now that we didn't know in 2006 before we had the experiences of 7/8 and 10/11?
I can respond from point of view to India. We can have experience from India. Like when in 1947 we were just producing 50 million tons of the food grains. And with the advancement of the introduction of the new technologies like the hybrid seeds, just introduction of one variety of wheat variety, that short duration variety, also irrigation, assured irrigation to 30% of the masses, and new hybrid varieties, irrigation, and the use of the chemicals had for plant production and also the fertilizer use. Now the food grid, we have become the self-sufficient in production by using the technological. Although we know there were some side effects of this green revolution, we had a lot of problem of the environmental problem created by the chemicals and all that. But that can be taken care by another technological solution. So technology is really, we have seen that how technology can make the food, we are food importer country, a self-sustainable country. That's the kind of reality which we have seen in this one. So technology, no doubt, has tremendous role to play in the food security. We know that as you rightly mentioned, that 300 billion people are still hungry, and the population is growing. We need to enhance our productivity by 70% more in order to cope up with this increasing population by 2050. How we are going to achieve it? We are going to achieve it through the technological solutions only. As my panelist Geraldo also mentioned that in Brazil, they could increase this productivity from 4 kg to up to 50 kg per hectare. By increasing the productivity itself, you can release the land masses for other uses. So that's the kind of reality which we have already seen in the power of the technology in increasing the food production. Yeah.
Can I add?
Of course.
One of the things that we learned in the last 10 years in the food volatility that we saw first in 2003 through 2007 and then a second time in 2011, 2012 was some nations in the first exercise to protect their own domestic constituencies, some exporting nations, large nations, banned exports. And that created a huge amount of problems and a fear all around the world about food shortages and more anxiety and panic buying, which exacerbated the volatility that was there. In 2011-12, that was avoided, and it was not only did people learn how damaging that was, but policymakers stepped in and they lobbied all governments to maintain an open position on trade. And the situation in 2012 actually, in many ways, by our analysis, was much more acute than the earlier event 5 years earlier, but the world somehow got through it by leaving markets open and having everybody kind of share in the adjustment process. So that was a good learning in that the last decade.
Yeah, I would agree with what Tim said, but I'd also am somewhat conflicted. I think definitely there's much greater awareness, and whether on the trade policy, also just among the producers here in the United States, a number of efforts really reaching out to the producers and really focusing on metrics and everything else. But when you think about it, we've gone through a decade of just global prosperity, global growth that has really lifted people up. But those same forces now, when you take a look at some of the countries that are reliant on, whether it's copper or other hard commodities, their economies are collapsing, and along with it, their food production systems and everything are really, really getting squeezed. And so I think we're entering into a greater period of uncertainty right now, given the current economic scenarios that we're seeing in a number of underdeveloped countries. And so that's something that we think about a lot in terms of what are the consequences of that going forward.
Other comments?
Yeah, very quickly. I think one important point is to stress that the results from agricultural research, they're not, you can get them in the short term. Eventually you start to do a research today, and it's going to take, 10, 15, 20 years, so you can move on. Just to give a quick example, we have some experiments in Brazil that shows that after 25, 27 years, the efficiency of phosphorus use was around 44% when only you have soy and corn rotations. When you introduce the pasture in these integrated crop livestock systems, the phosphorus efficiency increased to 88%. This is huge, but it took almost 3 decades so we can find this answer. So one thing that is very important when we have crisis is a good stimulus to increase research. But we need to keep this agenda not only when we have crisis. Otherwise, you're not going to have the answers when we need it.
So we're about an hour into this program, and we've been addressing the knowledge gap, the productivity gap, collaboration gaps, all of the things involved with the recommendations of the panel. And according to our program, my work's pretty much done. So I guess I'll see you over at the buffet table and grab myself a little cup of coffee here. Actually, seriously, this is the point where we turn it all over to you. We want to have a robust question and answer period. We have a couple very tempting microphones up here for anyone who would like to come up and ask a question or two of the panelists to discuss food security, what they're wondering about the policy, scientific, sustainability spheres. Please don't be bashful. Come on up. Please introduce yourself and whatever your affiliation is in this town, because the most important question in Washington is, what do you do? And I guess since people were more eager to get to this microphone, we'll start right over here.
Hi, I'm Shannon Maynard. I'm the executive director of the Congressional Hunger Center. You mentioned, Alan, that 800 million people today experience food security. We know the majority of them are smallholder farmers and women. I was curious to what level of attention was placed on those folks who are most impacted by food security and what role they will play in our future food systems.
These are all open.
So the smallholder farmers, particularly in Africa, are an opportunity to increase food security in the world. It was broadly accepted in this exercise that there's a lot of quote-unquote low-hanging fruit there where technology can be brought in to substantially increase productivity and increase food supply, to create buffers to take some stress off. So the success of smallholders is viewed broadly by, I think, everybody as not a bit somewhat challenging, of course. We've been working on this for many decades, but also part of the answer.
Yeah, and that also came out very clearly in one of the recommendations embedded from the teams.
On the gender question, very practically, where we work with smallholder farmers directly from a mass perspective, the likelihood of success, if you focus on women, is tremendously higher. So both in terms of farmers' incomes, family incomes, education level and health level of the children. So when focusing on smallholder farmers, the gender component is a critical one to predict success.
Over here.
Hi. Hello? Is this working? Hi. My name is Adam Shazel. I'm with the Office of Economic Policy at the Treasury Department. So it seems like one of the biggest challenges in the coming century is that we have a lot of these emerging economies. China and India have this very robust emergent middle class, and with that comes a greater appetite for more energy-intensive food sources like meat. So I think anything, this is going to be very important aspect in, developing these food strategies. I think the UN wants us to eat more bugs or something like that. Did this kind of changing dietary patterns, did this play a role in the simulation?
Yes, Europe taxed meat consumption, higher tax to discourage meat consumption, and in the U.S. team, it came out really in terms of talking and advocating for a diet shift. That came out as one of the recommendations.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Heather Coleman from Oxfam America. Thank you so much for having this panel. So I have two questions. The first is just there have been comments about realistic scenarios, and then the gentleman from Cargill's comments about historic data being represented. It concerned me to hear some of those points just because clearly we're in a new normal. Since the beginning of the century, we've had 15 of the warmest years on records. We just had the warmest year on record in 2015. It seems a bit irresponsible not to talk about, for over a decade, the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry has been modeling based on forecasts, not just based on historic data. So maybe people can clarify exactly what went into the modeling exercise for me. The second piece of this is just we have been doing a lot of work with the food and beverage industry on some of these issues, and really appreciate some of the leadership that Mars and others have taken in the space. And one of the things that we've seen at Oxfam is there are very few companies that are developing broad resilience strategies and climate resilience strategies. We see a lot of climate change proposals, strategies, et cetera, but those don't actually integrate a broad value chain assessment of where you actually can build resilience in the system and really build resilience with smallholders also taken into account. So I just wondered, Matthias, if you could comment on that a bit. Thank you.
First, Tim, tell us a little bit about heat.
Yeah, it was Heather, right? That's right. Yeah, Heather, those were good questions. On the first issue of the realism of the projections, we not only started with a baseline into the future going out, out 2020 to 2030, and I think a realistic baseline extended from the past about the expansion of demand as people's incomes rise, as population rises, et cetera. But to that, we added volatility, historic volatility, and then we accentuated it, and we created more dynamism in the cropping production and the yields than has ever been experienced before. So, and we moved to record price levels in two of the four scenarios, so two of the four rounds of the scenario. So it was out of sample. It was unprecedented what we programmed into the exercise. We just didn't want to go way beyond that and make it ridiculous. As you go out another 20, 30 years, if the science is all in place, it will be even more dramatic than what we saw. But this was a near-term 2020 to 2030 exercise.
So just to be clear, because I think your question dealt a lot with climate modeling, what was how did warmer, more volatile weather play into the scenario?
By impacting yields to record levels and then stacking those events around the world to happen more frequently in the game, I think we were incorporating the rising heat in the world.
Is that useful? Okay. Matthias?
Yeah, so to Heather's question, when we started to look at how do we deliver against the objective to become carbon neutral or to be less of responsible for emitting greenhouse gases, we realized that what is in our control, i.e., what happens in our factories, what happens after we made our products, is only perhaps 20% of our carbon emissions. 80% of the carbon emissions happen actually before food is manufactured. And that's I think, a key thing food systems need to address. They are not only victim to climate change, they are also a driver of carbon emission and of climate change. And there are some in the agriculture industry who say, well, let's not talk much about that. There is so much talk about cars and about the energy sector. Why would we bother to make that a more sticking point? And I believe there are two reasons for it. One, agriculture production needs to change. It needs to be less water intensive in terms of fertilizers. It needs to be much less reliant on fertilizers. And on the other side, we need to help farmers to better adjust to climate change. As much as I hope that the carbon emissions will be reduced and the pace of climate change will reduce, there is a lot of adjustment that will have to go on in the next 20 to 30 years for us to kind of maintain quite a more or less stable situation. So that's kind of the key for me, is that the next conversations about climate change, the meetings after Paris, focus much more on the role of agriculture, both in terms of food insecurity and in terms of the contribution to global warming that comes from that sector.
If you allow me to contribute, this part of agriculture is important to highlight that agriculture can contribute to mitigate climate change. When we are talking about increasing soil organic matter in the soil, this means that we are capturing carbon from the atmosphere and stocking this carbon in the soil. So agriculture can indeed contribute to mitigate climate change too. And when we increase soil organic matter, especially in tropical soils, we are going to increase what? Water retention, we are going to increase nutrient retention, we are going to increase the potential to increase productivity in a more sustainable way.
Yeah, I would just add, I think Heather's asked a really good question, but I would be looking at it from a different perspective. Most of the food in the emerging economies really does not flow through the supply chains of a Cargill or a Mars, right? And so you have these populations that are really, really exposed to those issues that are really local issues, right? And that's really where I see the biggest gap, right, in terms of how do you reach that population that is so important to feeding local people rather than, you know, the internationally traded commodities, if you will. And I think that that's where the real challenge is going to be going forward, and that's a much bigger challenge than it is working on some of these global, you know, food and beverage supply chains. I mean, that's where the real challenge is.
Great, thank you. I'm Tanya Raw with CARE. Thank you for having this event, and that's actually a great segue into the question I wanted to ask, and it also links back a bit to the question from my colleague from the Congressional Hunger Center. In the last several years, we've seen a lot more dialogue about this intersection between food security and climate change, and it's incredibly welcome. But a lot of that dialogue, and I will say including today's discussion, has focused on the production side and how technology is the silver bullet. But when we look at the work that we've done with vulnerable communities, we see that people are impacted differently based on issues of inequality, based on issues of access to resources. So how did those issues come into play in designing the games and then also in the solutions that you identified, addressing issues like governance, gender inequality, as well as just access for small-scale food producers to resources? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say at a very high level. To be honest with you, it was really about technology transfer, getting extension programs up and running, greater investment, and on-the-ground assistance, but really at a high level. It was not enough time to really drill into all of it, but it was really at a high level, recognizing the need is there, but the resources and the infrastructure really has to be built, right? And that's one of the concerns out there.
Well, and I'm very glad that this question was being asked because, one of the things about finding a solution is first you have to agree on your terms and what the problems are. And I do think it's an important, when people are talking about something like a productivity gap, to at least acknowledge that to some folks there is no such thing as a productivity gap, because on a per person per calorie basis, the world can feed itself now. People will talk about things like food waste. They will talk about things like poverty and income inequality. And they hear this need to create 60% more food by 2050 and wonder, is that really going to solve the problem for those 800 million people, or is it something else? And so I'd like to open that up to the panel to define exactly what a productivity gap means, and what other factors aside from productivity can be needed to really effectively reach those 800 million people.
I can come up with a practical example. If you think about a product that the World Food Program buys, and that was kind of very, very much seen as an important new item, plum peanut, like a peanut-based product for intervention. The cost to produce plum peanut is as high as the cost to produce a Snickers. And there is a productivity gap in identifying more sophisticated products, staple products that are high in micronutrients, that can address undernutrition and malnutrition in urban areas, at times can help to support school lunch programs everywhere, including in rural areas. And that is to leverage the technology and the productivity that exists in packaged goods in support of addressing malnutrition for people who currently can't even dream of this kind of products because nobody really applies the technology in that way. So that requires a lot of shifts. Some of them are technology, and some are just like having an innovative, fresh approach to it. And the other topic is, as I said before, I think that from a cultural perspective, and there's a reason why agriculture is called agriculture, there is a lot we need to bear in mind, and gender is one very important topic that needs to be taken into account in identifying the right solutions.
So, Alan, about the 800 million people that are undernourished, we've looked at this question and the data around this very carefully. FAO studies this, and they make estimates about the size of the caloric gap for the nations that add up to that 800 million people. We have calculated the amount of grain it would take to fill that caloric gap for those 800 million people. It amounts to 30 million tons of grain globally in a 3 billion ton grain and oilseed system in the world. So we're today about 1% short, which is about 1/5 of the amount that we use for biofuels. We think that, as you said, there's enough food in the world today, not for the long run, but for the moment. And the problem is purchasing power. And at this point, the best thing would be for people that are poor to have more cash to be able to afford their food, to buy their food.
Yeah, it's purchasing power, but it's also distribution. And if you take the challenge is really big when you take a look, say, at some of the African countries. In the next 15 years, 20 African countries are going to see their population grow by at least 70%, right? And so when you think about that growth rate, that's enough to stagger, a developed country in terms of that. And then you start taking a look at the access issue. They're already calorie deficient in many parts of those countries already, and then you start to take a look at their resource base and their water availability and all of that. And so the question really is, this is about how do you start building up the capacity locally to start confronting that. It is a big challenge, and really being able to build out, to your point, Tim, is making sure that there's going to be a distribution system into those places, because right now it's not, right? We've got famine breaking out in Ethiopia right now, and we're all having this conversation. And Ethiopia is a country that has been highlighted as one of the more prosperous countries in the region. But there are other countries that are really suffering, and we're going to see this playing out more and more every year as we go forward, because every year we're going to see more and more people.
Additional comments?
Hi, I'm Molly John, University of Wisconsin, and a couple other institutions and also chair of the adjudication cell for the game. And I wanted to invite the panelists to comment on one finding I think is extremely important and really speaks to the issue that was just raised, and is certainly very important to the research community, and that relates to transparency about the global food system. One of the key recommendations is the need to build new information sharing systems that enhance food security. So basic information about global grain stocks, for example. And one of the exciting outcomes I've seen from the food chain reaction just in the couple of months since is increased traction on the part of especially private sector, but also multilateral organizations toward really digging in on what that information sharing infrastructure might look like, how to make it more dynamic, more accurate. And certainly companies like Cargill and Mars know a great deal about this. And I think many feel that sharing that information is an important step towards stabilizing the food system and empowering all to recognize the need for improved management of that. And I just think it would be exciting to hear you comment on this recommendation and actions you think need to be taken along those lines.
And just to note, we have about 10 minutes left, and there are a couple of microphones that would love to have mouths to feed in. So don't hesitate to formulate additional questions. We have time for a couple more.
So, Molly, that's an excellent question. And one of the areas of great uncertainty and where information is not very transparent is the actual level of food stock in the world. There are some nations whose estimates of that are very opaque. So very large nations, and it creates risk in the world because we really, we might think we have a lot of food, but maybe the bins are more empty than we think. And some of that information is contained because for national security reasons in some countries, and we would believe that the world would be better off if those numbers were disclosed. I'm not sure they're known with a level of 100% accuracy, but they might be 80% accurate. It would be good to have confirmation of some of those numbers. What's that?
Any ideas about
what to do about that? Maybe the public powers that be can come to some agreement about disclosure of such things.
And I would like to add, the topic came up before. Is there a competitive advantage if you have your buyers teams who know a little bit more than competition and buy a little bit smarter? The disadvantage that comes from the intransparency in terms of those who don't actually deal with buying food but with futures and kind of completely distort the market, this whole conversation about speculation, are so much bigger than the smartest buyer we could employ at Mars that for us having more transparency helps. And I give an example on a crop that will certainly not feed the world but is really important to us, cocoa. We are very transparent about the challenges in the cocoa sector because we want to create a better understanding of all stakeholders, what is needed to kind of drive yield improvements and general improvements for farming in that area. So I believe that there's so much more upside to transparency that the competitive disadvantage or the competitive advantage you had before because you employed the smartest buyers is like minuscule compared to the other effects.
Some thoughts. In 2012, Embrapa started its strategic intelligence system. And one thing about this intelligence thing is that 80-85% perhaps of the information you need is already available, as Tim said. So this is a very important point. Eventually, you have some information. You don't have exactly the information, but if you have a very huge power to analyze the available information, you can have a good perspective, a good picture of what to wait. So it's not only regarding the transparency, I think it's regarding the analysis power that we are going to have and how we are going to use it. So this is an important issue to remark.
Hello, my name is Katie Cronin. I work with TechnoServe here in DC. So earlier in the discussion, we talked about how part of the outcome of the food chain reaction game was a realization that we really need to come together in terms of the private-public sectors. And I know a buzzword today that we face all the time in doing donor-funded projects is PPP, public-private partnerships. And that's the greatest thing if you can get a PPP. And one thing that we know is that they're really, really hard to put together. And oftentimes a lot of the challenges, of course, is getting the public sector funding, but also getting corporations to commit money to the PPPs can be very challenging. So my question is more for Tim and Matthias. What sections of your value chains do you think are ripe for a PPP, and what would a value proposition be for you to want to engage in a public-private partnership with the government or with nonprofits along your value chains in a particular food? There you go.
So I'll try to answer first. And first of all, I'd like to just say TechnoServe is a very impressive organization. I think everybody around the world that looks at the work TechnoServe does is really impressed. An area that might be ripe for working together, in my opinion, I was just in Africa for 2.5 weeks and have been studying it very actively in the last, somewhat for 20, 25 years, but much more so in the last 5 years. In an area that we actually struggle with in Cargill is the interface with smallholders and making that sustainable, economically sustainable. We want to be part of the solution in that interface, help those smallholders advance, improve their incomes, improve their nutrition, but it is hard to make it a break-even proposition for a business. So that might be an area where we can have some collaboration.
I'd agree with that. I would add one area to it, and that is the area of food safety. So if you look at a country like China, that was probably the most successful country in lifting people out of poverty in the last 30 years, their biggest challenge is a topic like food safety. There's a lot of openness to work in that space. We see a lot of pull for that in Africa on topics like aflatoxin, for example, and other poison that is linked to water shortages and climate change. So I believe the food safety topic is one that is A, pre-competitive, and B, one that needs a lot of attention from a lot of different stakeholders.
We have 2 people in line and time for really one question. So I'd like you both to ask your questions, and the panelists will address as they see fit, and then we'll make sort of our closing remarks and our call to action and have coffee. Please.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to make it good. I'm from the Commerce Department, and I want to underscore the importance of what the private sector has just said just now about the importance of the supply chain. I think the point was made that it is a bad actor in the sense of emissions, but at the same time, when it goes through globally, it has a stabilizing effect, not only economically, but distribution, technology, all through the world.
So your question is?
My question is, suppose that in the future export bans were to come back, suppose the licensings aren't honored, let's say that there are going to be more and more barriers as the emerging countries, become more in peril, maybe. Can you see a way for a private sector to answer the Kissinger question of who do I call for all these problems? You were talking about an organic approach from the last few years of addressing these. Can you think of a central way that we can systematically approach this?
Who can we call at 3 a.m.? Hold that thought. Second half.
Very briefly. I'm Sean Babington. I'm a staffer to the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. And acknowledging your point, Alan, at the outset that we ought not to get too bogged down in domestic policy, maybe.
You're about to say something that starts with an S or an HR, aren't you? Okay.
No.
Okay.
I'm not. But it does strike me that this is such a unique exercise that you all went through with such an impressive group of people from across the political spectrum. So given that, if you could distill some top-line themes that folks in Congress might think about or explore in the future, in to prepare, to respond. Could you comment on a couple of those?
Okay, so these are both great final questions. And just to not confuse the audience, S and HR are the beginnings of congressional bill numbers, which is the sort of stuff the committee staffers are obsessed about. We got a little bit broader on this one, so let's finish it up. Who would you trust? What is the opportunity to have some sort of central thing that can help break down the barriers with food security? And then our final question there. Open it up.
So the first answer, I think, to the first question is I see, despite some bad signs, I see better governance emerging around the world in many nations of the world. And I think better policy can come from better governments. So I think we hopefully won't have to call, but they'll choose to have more enlightened policies. The other thing is, in terms of dealing with this issue, I just think we need to depressurize it. We need to talk about science, and we need to talk calmly with each other and explain clearly to each other across the full spectrum of opinions to deal with this question rationally.
Yeah, I want to say that we had a couple of the key countries that are needed to address that issue sitting around the table at the war game. One was missing, and it's a really important one, and that is Russia. They're a major grain producer in the world, and they need to be part of this, and they need to be respected as being part of this. So fast forward 20 years, one of my biggest hopes is that the current challenges that are existing on a geopolitical level will not be as much a hindrance as they are today in addressing those challenges. So certainly one of the numbers on speed dial will be a number in Russia, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on where you stand.
Any other thoughts? Well, our time has run short, and one more. Okay.
Just one on the second question. It was a great question, and one of the things that came out on the U.S. team, there was an individual from OPEC and really raised the possibility of sort of a realignment of funding sources within the U.S. There's some 14 different sources that could be realigned and much more concentrated and much more flexible to create a single climate investment fund targeting overseas climate smart ag and development initiatives. It's sort of a investment arm, but there are just so many different funds out there. How can you align them and make them much more targeted and also make them much more agile? Okay, so just a lot of opportunity, and in terms of it's not really asking for money, it's just being smarter about how we use it.
Any final thoughts on this or anything else? Well, this is a very difficult and complex global problem, and it has been an issue for the planet for a long time. As our scenario shows, it's expected to continue one. One of the themes of this report was that instability and volatility are the new normal. Both are inevitably linked to food security. But on this issue, let's at least give our panelists a round of applause for taking a crack at it. And I'm sure that most, if not all of them, will be able to stick around for a little bit if you are able to and have any follow-up questions. So thank you very much. That concludes our program.